Okay, let's begin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary Allen. I'm the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation, and we're the host for this series of webinars that we've been putting on over the past nearly a year almost now about various programs, projects, policies, and initiatives that will frame the future of forestry in Maryland. It's our pleasure to share these subjects as a way of stretching minds, getting people to think about new ideas, and ultimately to talk more widely about how the topics are shaping up that will affect the way we're going to continue to support and expand forestry. It's an exciting time for forestry, and we're pleased that this webinar series can be part of your thinking and experience in looking ahead at the issues that will affect the future of forestry in Maryland. We're the host, but our moderator for these sessions is a former Mel Fellow of the foundations. And so we're very pleased, and I am especially honored to present Megan Carr as the moderator for the series today. And she's been our moderator for all of these sessions, and we look forward to continuing to work with her in the future of the program. Megan, I want to turn it over to you so you can introduce the panel and today's topic. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Gary. And first, we'd like to take a moment to recognize some of our sponsors. So this month, we'd like to thank the Rural Maryland Council for their support. The Rural Maryland Council brings together citizens, community-based organizations, federal, state, county, and municipal government officials, as well as representatives of for-profit and nonprofit sectors to collectively address the needs of rural Maryland communities. So we just want to say thanks to them for helping us to spread the word about these events. As we get ready to start our discussion, a brief note on engaging with our speakers. If you have questions that you would like our speakers to address, please enter those into the Q&A section in Zoom. For most of your screens, they'll be found at the bottom. The separate chat function can be used for wider discussion with our audience, but the Q&A helps us to organize those questions more clearly and help us keep track. I will also note that our speakers will be somewhat less able to address individual site-specific questions, but questions about broader deer management issues are very welcome. So please do enter those into the Q&A. On to today's topic. White-tailed deer are a native species beloved by many. However, land development leading to habitat fragmentation and the absence of predators other than the front end of an F-150 have led to high population densities. In current densities, deer have significant and often negative ecological impacts, including limiting generation of native tree species and exacerbating invasion by non-native invasive plants. Complicating this picture, management options for deer vary widely in urban versus rural communities, and also by property ownership and a number of other factors. So to help us untangle that complexity, we're joined by two experts today. First, we're joined by George Timko. George is a veteran wildlife biologist with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources with over 30 years of wildlife management experience and over 20 years experience in deer management. He specializes in urban deer management, deer damage abatement, and deer disease management. I will turn it over to you, George.
Thank you, Megan. I'll go ahead and try to start my screen share. If that doesn't work properly, we'll have Megan interject. Looks like it was there. Can you guys see that?
Unfortunately,
George,
no.
Okay. It says I'm sharing.
Yep, and we're currently seeing your presenter view.
Okay. How about
Perfect.
now?
Looks great.
Very good. Well,
We got it.
as you guys all know, deer are a very interesting creature, and they generate a lot of interest and concern from Maryland's public. In this particular webinar, we're going to talk about deer, and I'm going to give you the basic information on deer management in Maryland, an overview of the population, how we got to where we are now with the deer herd, and some insight into how to manage that. And Luke is going to follow up with additional information. So hopefully we can tag team this and get it done pretty quickly. I've got a lot of slides, so I'm going to go through relatively quickly. So some of the history of deer management in Maryland. Pre-colonial times, deer were very abundant. Native Americans, Native Marylanders used them for everything they needed to survive and used virtually every part of the deer. And over time, the Maryland legislature saw fit to protect them and create situations where people couldn't just hunt them year round. Around the turn of the 1800s, deer were almost extirpated from the state. Roughly, and the only deer left in most of the state of Maryland were in the western portions and the remote western Maryland mountains due to differing factors, mostly market hunting and loss of habitat. Virtually regulations weren't being followed. There was really little enforcement of the regulations that did exist. And our deer herd had dwindled, and there were populations mainly in Garrett and Allegheny counties. The 1900s to the 1960s, that was a period which we called protection and restocking. The state prohibited hunting or limited hunting to antlered only hunting to allow that population to grow and effectively protecting the females and the reproductive segment of the population. We instituted a hunting license requirement, and then we started restocking deer from Western Maryland and other areas. We actually traded deer from other surrounding states for other critters such as turkeys. In the 20s through the 70s, we started regrowing populations of deer. We created some refuges. One of our first wildlife management areas, or the first wildlife management area in the state, Winbrook, was our first deer refuge. And in that particular property, we utilized that to improve the habitat and increase deer numbers from that area. And then, of course, those deer expanded as the surrounding habitat improved from urban growth, tree plantings, and forestry growth. From the 1980s to the present, our population of deer has made a full recovery. And as you see, much, much more. Our deer refuges and open space programs have created more refugia for deer, providing them with adequate, more than adequate food, habitat, and cover that they need. Our current farming practices actually have improved, and those farming resources are much more nutritious than a lot of the native forage for deer, allowing them to have higher reproductive output. And a lot of the hunted farmland areas that were once managed using hunting were converted to suburbia and/or areas where hunting was no longer permitted. These things combined, favorable habitat, few predators, mild climate, resulted in a very healthy deer population. This chart shows you the estimate of deer abundance over the years from the 1980s to the most recent year. And you can see that population climbed dramatically from the 80s to the 2000s. We put the brakes on that population by incurring longer hunting seasons, bigger bag limits, and more opportunities for hunters and/or sharpshooting farmers and sharpshooters to take deer. And we've roughly stabilized that population. And these are the benefactors of our deer management. Not just Maryland's hunters, but a lot of the public enjoy seeing deer, as well as the non-consumptive recreational uses of whitetails. Our budget is funded mostly through special funds, hunting license sales, and federal aid or Pittman-Robertson tax, which reimburses states on the use of those funds. Unfortunately, deer have negative consequences as well. Deer damage to cropland, damage to forests, urban, suburban problems, and of course, the problems that come with deer-human conflicts, deer vehicle collisions, loss of landscaping plants and gardens, etc. In Maryland, $9 million is attributed to agricultural wildlife damage in the state, and roughly $7.5 million of that is attributable to deer. That does not show the cost of deer vehicle collisions in the state at roughly over $100 million in damage annually. And Costs associated with forests and to landowners is unknown. So whitetails have evolved into basically a runaway train. This species is very coveted by hunters. It is known as a keystone herbivore in the fact that it can have negative consequences on all the critters that live in that habitat with the deer have influence over. They do generate the majority of revenue for state game agencies. So deer really aren't, deer management is funding not just deer management, but a lot of the other species of wildlife out there. And as you can see, they are very controversial species for most agencies because it's difficult to manage deer and keep everybody happy. And everybody's opinion on deer matters. We take those into consideration, but as you can tell, it can be very challenging to manage deer for all of Marylanders. We do manage deer following a deer management plan. I've been present through all of the deer plans listed here. And our most recent plan spans from 2020 through 2034. And the goal of that plan, or the overreaching goal of that plan, is to manage deer for the balance between the cultural carrying capacity and biological carrying capacity of that species. Our primary options to manage deer in the state are hunter harvest, where hunting can be used, deer management permits, i.e. crop damage permits for farmers, deer cooperator permits or sharpshooting permits, fencing, netting, tree tubes, repellents, and deer contraceptives or sterilization, which we'll talk about very briefly. So as hunting is our number one tool, we have a lot of influence on how the seasons and bag limits occur. We allow hunting from early September through February 3rd annually. A lot of deer can be taken in the majority of the state. Quite frankly, these large bag limits seem that we're going overboard to a lot of the hunters, but the fact is those bag limits were put in place to help landowners manage deer on their own properties using hunters. In the western region of the state, the bag limit is reduced simply because the habitat and the winter mortality of white-tailed deer in that region can be much more severe than it can in the eastern portion of the state. We do encourage the harvest of antlerless deer when a landowner is having issues. So rather than his hunters targeting mostly bucks, we encourage them to take female and antlerless deer. And we do allow multiple seasons, muzzleloader season, crossbows, firearms, modern rifles and cartridges as well. As much as we have an influence on, we encourage Sunday hunting in those counties which will permit it. And you can see this chart shows our harvest from the first hunting seasons in the 1920s to our most recent season. The purple, I think it shows a purple for you guys on the chart there, shows our antlered deer harvest or buck harvest, and the white or cream colored shows our antlerless harvest. And you can see over time from starting to only having buck harvests in the 20s to allowing more antlerless harvest in the 60s to encouraging more antlerless harvest than antlered harvest in the most recent couple decades. And you can see that population climbed and it has decreased as well over time. To give you some examples of how the deer population and harvest has gone on some of our forested lands in the state. This chart shows you the deer harvest on Savage River State Forest. And again, following that similar curve, the deer population and the harvest likewise increased and then declined and stabilized. Green Ridge State Forest in Allegheny County, a similar trend as you can see with this chart. And Pocomoke State Forest on the eastern shore, that population has grown and declined somewhat and stabilized. So our secondary management option is deer management permits. That is they are often referred to as crop damage permits by farmers. Those permits can also be provided to forest landowners who have a forest management plan and apply for the permits through our regional staff. to chart the harvest of deer under those permits, you can see that through the 2000s, that deer population and the harvest subsequently was increasing. And then and you see that big drop between 2004 and 2007. That was when we increased the opportunities for hunters to take deer, and they did. And that trend, as you see, the harvest and deer management permits is somewhat increasing here in the last couple of years. Unfortunately, even with the deer management permits allowing landowners and their shooters, their listed shooters, to take deer basically throughout the year outside of the hunting season, hunters don't take really or utilize a lot of the deer that they can possibly or potentially take under those permits. Statewide in 2021 to 22, hunters or shooters on deer management permits theoretically could have harvested 32,000 plus deer, and they harvested 8,700 deer, roughly utilizing 27% of the tags. Other lethal and non-lethal measures. Deer cooperator permits, also known as sharpshooting. Those permits are utilized in many urban, suburban areas where hunting is generally not permitted. Managed hunts, a higher level of having hunting more restrictive and run by a hunt manager and per se to try to restrict and regulate how and where those hunters hunt. Exclusion methods, fencing, netting, and tree tubes, very useful for individual properties. Repellents, sterilization, and contraception. The challenges we face today is that our hunters are declining basically through attrition. Our hunters are aging out. In today's society, people aren't as interested in hunting as they once were. There are other things occupying their time. And you can see from some of the pictures those things. The other thing that we've experienced with the decline of hunters is a bag limit saturation. And what we mean by that is that hunters are only willing to take so many deer. With the big bag limits we have, very few hunters ever reach that big bag limit. This chart shows our licensed sales over time. And you can see that trend is alarming. It's declined pretty precipitously. The dark gray in the chart shows our resident hunters. The other bars in the chart above the gray show non-resident hunters and youth hunters. And even with the addition of non-resident hunters, our overall trend is declining. A bigger challenge to managing deer is access to the land to where the deer are in order to control them. So in retrospect, basically, there are more deer refuges out there now as our urban and suburban areas increase. The biggest challenge we face today is trying to find some way to manage deer in the urban and suburban interface where these animals live alongside with people. Suburbia. This is our biggest challenge when it comes to trying to manage deer and trying to find solutions for the people who live there to try to live with those deer. As a department, we actually look at oncoming and ongoing technologies that try to utilize non-lethal measures to reduce and control deer populations, such as fertility control. And it's very difficult to get consensus on any level from Maryland's residents on what is a good deer population level and how to manage that population. And of course, politics oftentimes conflict directly with the goals of trying to manage deer in this landscape. Crop damage issues are always on the rise with increasing costs for fuel and increasing costs to raise crops. Of course, farmers have more increasing concerns. And then, of course, there are disease issues as well that we have to deal with in the state, and I won't talk about that here today. With that, I'll move on to allow Luke to present, and then we can answer any questions as Megan sees fit. Thank you.
Great, thank you, George. So yeah, so please do start putting those questions into the Q&A, and we will have George and Luke address those at the end of the session. But for now, we'll move on. So Luke McCauley is a wildlife management specialist for the University of Maryland Extension. His research and extension program covers wildlife conservation, game management, habitat management, hunting, natural history, and wildlife damage. Luke has published 17 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and extension publications. He earned his undergrad degree from the University of Notre Dame and his graduate degree from, my notes disappeared, all my secrets exposed.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. I'm just looking to my cheat sheet. And your master's degree in range management and PhD in wildlife management from University of California, Berkeley. We'll also leave some time for Luke to mention some other upcoming educational opportunities that will be hosted by the University of Maryland Extension, and we'll have some links for folks to check out in the chat. So thank you, Luke, and please take it away.
Yeah, let me fix my screen share. I'm having a little hiccup here because it's sharing the slideshow on. I have two screens and it's sharing on the other screen, and I practiced this beforehand, but let me fix this. Sorry. No, we did so perfect in the practice, and here we are. Stop share here. Let me fix my share. Okay, we'll do this again.
I guess while you're working on that, I'll share a couple other notes on that other education opportunity.
Thank you.
So the University of Maryland Extension, in partnership with the University of Delaware and other partners, including the Virginia Department of Forestry and the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, is hosting a volunteer training program for woodland stewardship. This educational program will cover forest management, wildlife management, prescribed fire, water quality, and communication strategies. And that training is going to include 6 weekly virtual meetings starting Tuesday, October 4th, and a Saturday field visit. So those interested in the program can apply at a link that will be provided in the chat. I'll also provide the email address for the contact person in case folks have questions on that. And I'm sure Luke will also be able to fill you in with more details.
Absolutely. And you can learn more about that at go.umd.edu/Delmarva. And how about I just put that in the chat real quick? So we'd love to have more applicants, especially if you live on the Delmarva Peninsula and manage forests. So it's go.umd.edu/Delmarva. And I'm going to send that out to everybody. Oh, okay. You guys can share that out on the chat.
Yeah, Gary, do we have chat to everyone enabled? Right now, I'm only seeing host and panelist options. But we'll let you get to your presentation.
Can you see my presentation? Is the screen looking good?
I'll see if I can open it up.
Great.
Perfect.
So I like to start with an outline, show you where we're going. We're going to briefly zip through a lot of these things, and I'll try and keep it quick and leave some time for questions. So I'd like to start with what's the problem, describe some of that issue. Many of you, if you're here, probably already have your own thoughts on this, but we can go a little bit into that issue. Talk a little bit about deer biology and the life cycle and how that could impact, especially damage issues. And then we'll talk about assessing deer impacts, figuring out, do you have a problem? What are the kind of problems you might be facing? And finally, really the bulk of the talk will be talking about mitigating deer impacts. So it's very much focused on damage. I know a lot of people might want to attract deer, and that's great. And I do some of that myself. I'm a hunter. And some of these aspects that show up in the mitigation of damage are also useful if you want to learn about attracting deer for hunting and food plots. So I have some resources there too for you. So what are some of the ecological impacts of white-tailed deer? Well, there's been a lot of research, a really rich variety of studies performed looking at how deer impact certain types of native plants. The study on the left talks about orchids that are really declining. They're preferred forage by deer. The top right here talks about issues with less native plant richness and increased certain number of invasive plants. On the bottom, we have additional aspects of changes in the forest structure as well, caused by high deer populations, which is pretty common in large parts of Maryland. So the Here's a quick picture of what really just a picture is worth 1,000 words, and it really illustrates the differences. On one side of this fence, you had deer control, and while that fence doesn't stop all deer, it certainly retards their ability to get over. So you can see the kind of difference that can happen over time. So I think we all can recognize in a lot of places, generally most people I talk to can sort of have gotten to know the issues of the ecological and high abundant deer populations. And George mentioned deer vehicle collisions. Well, let's talk about some of the sort of underlying dynamics that that are good, I think, to understand in addressing deer issues. I'd like to start out with carrying capacity. This is a sort of theoretical model of what populations do. And George mentioned how back in about 100 years ago, we had this very small population with slow growth on the left. And over time, you end up getting this fast growth as the population starts to hit this sort of key area. And then as they reach carrying capacity, they reach this sort of stable equilibrium. Now, this is the ideal model ecologists like to use to model deer populations. But in reality, what happens is that sometimes deer will overshoot their capacity. And that's where you have this red line, which is a little bit closer to reality, where you have all of a sudden populations can really get too high and they can sort of eat themselves out of house and home. And you can see a lot of impacts, and then they will probably die off. So you might have these periods where, gosh, where did the deer come from? All of a sudden there's a lot of deer. And then the next year, you might not have many at all. So this is the type of thing that's driving that. And a lot of factors go into these populations. Everything from disease to weather can really drive these kind of dips. Another aspect about deer is they're generally considered crepuscular. Oftentimes, and during the hunting season, I would say they go nocturnal. But this is a graph showing the hour of the day and deer photos that were taken for a research study I did out in California on a related species of deer. It's a type of mule deer out there, black-tailed deer, but white-tailed deer follow very similar patterns where you have this sort of morning and evening peaks of activity. Of course, the bucks and the more mature animals tend to focus on more nocturnal activity, especially during the deer hunting season. How much do deer eat a day? Here's a picture out of Mississippi State University. They'll eat about 6 to 8% of their body weight daily in wet weight of vegetation. Here's a picture of what that might look like. So a 150-pound deer is eating about 9 to 12 pounds of green forage a day. So that's quite substantial when you look at it and actually weigh it out. The annual cycle of the deer populations will start in November with the breeding season, when you actually, if any hunters in the room know about something we call the rut, which is the time in which the males are out. You might see them in the daylight when you've never seen them before. Their patterns all change and they're chasing does to breed them in a short period of time. Out in February, all the bucks will lose their antlers every February, and they regrow them every year. And out in May and June, just a few weeks, about a month or so ago, they started dropping fawns. And in June, July, right about now, we're starting to hit this period of peak, what they call peak lactation, where the greatest energy needs. I like to show this all in a picture. I'm very much a visual learner. So here's a sort of a stylized image of nutritional needs of a female deer that becomes pregnant and has a fawn. And in red is the period. Let's say this starts in November and early December. The doe becomes pregnant, and that red section of the line, the height of this bar is the energy needs. And so as it's red, that doe is pregnant, and she needs more and more food to grow the developing fetus. And then she has the fawn in around June 1st, give or take a few weeks. And all of a sudden her nutrition needs go even higher. So she's providing milk and for herself. So they will eat almost time and a half, 150% of normal food. So you might start to see, I like to show this because you might start to see impacts right around that fawning period when they really hone in on food and really need a lot of nutrition, something you might not have seen a few weeks earlier even. This is a slide showing that's also that same dynamic, and the deer are they take advantage of the seasonal aspect. In the early spring, you don't have a lot of vegetation, but it tends to have really high quality protein levels and other things. But those plants are all very small, so these deer can really make a lot of impact at that springtime. If you have fresh young plants, it's the most nutritious for deer, but there's not a lot of it, so it can be very apparent impacts during that spring period of time. And something that might be really frustrating to people if you're trying to manage for deer, this is an image of a study. We're working on soybean damage actually in agricultural areas, but the height of these bars is the number of pictures we captured on motion activated trail cameras of deer grazing on different varieties of soybeans. And the different colors of the height of those bars are different varieties. But the thing I like to show this for is to show the sort of what we call stochasticity, or the sort of randomness associated with deer activity. So you had, in this case, we had in 3 nights, these 3 spikes, about almost half of all the deer grazing activity occurred in these 3 nights, and they were separated by about a week. And interestingly, and I'm not sure if this will hold, these events also happened about 2 days, 1 to 2 days after a rainfall event. So it's possible that there could be something, especially with soybeans, that deer are honing in on after rainfall. But just to show that sort of how you might not be a big problem and all of a sudden it hits, and that could help explain that. There are a lot of different ways to assess deer damage, and I'll zip through this quickly. But if you're interested in really trying to document and for a research study, or to have to write a report on anything, there's a variety of different options out there for you. Let me move this thing. I'm going to hide this little panel. And so I'm not going to go into all this, but there are a variety of available tools if you need to measure deer damage. Here's an example. An easier technique than those statistical techniques is putting up a small exclosure and seeing the differences in the inside and outside. And this was in my backyard area in springtime, just this last spring. And it's just really quite surprising to see that they're not there that often. They're relatively low densities of deer, but they do make a big impact over time. Here's a picture of what can happen in soybean fields. And another technique is to just look at the types of trees that are in your forests. If you find forests that are dominated by kind of low preference deer species, it might be a sign you have high deer numbers. The simplest technique of all is what we call cultural carrying capacity. And if somebody is frustrated if their garden plants get chewed off. I do like to note, we talk a lot about deer, but there are other animals out there, rabbits in particular, can sometimes cause surprising amount of damage when you're not expecting it. They surprised me on one of my deer studies where the rabbits would go inside exclosures and be protected from predators and be able to eat all the soybeans inside these circles on this picture from above that you see. If you see these little bare spots, that's where rabbits could go in and hide from foxes and hawks and eat all the soybeans inside. So mitigation, and I'll zip through these 4 main types of mitigation you have available. There are vegetation management, fencing, repellents, and population management. I think it's good to sort of look at, as Megan was introducing, we might not be able to give all the advice for any particular property, because certain properties might be able to use certain of these tools based on the layout of the property and what's going on. So we'll roll through them all and get some examples. So the first one I like to start with is vegetation management. Backing up to that sort of theoretical aspect, we can go back to like high school science class with a trophic pyramid, and the idea that plants sort of form the building blocks of our sort of pyramid of life. And the trophic pyramid, trophic means nutrition, and sort of the base level from which all other animals feed. So it's really important to manage your vegetation. And I think there's 3 main ways to manage it. One is to select unpalatable plants that you're going to be planting in your forestry operation, or if you have whatever type of stuff you're managing for. The other aspect is you could plant preferred plants and try to attract deer away from certain areas. And then finally, there's, I think, forest openings can also provide a place in which will attract deer to these places. Now, for these preferred plant and the forest openings, when you're creating more food to attract deer, you got to remember you're also going to be increasing the carrying capacity. So you're also in a certain way feeding deer, and you could then have a carry-on effect in the future of increasing the population by providing more food. We have a great list. A lot of websites have unpalatable plant lists. I will share those in the chat at the end of the talk. And I will share those links for you so you can look at them. But there's a lot of good resources. In terms of attracting or diverting deer, here's a food plot I planted on the right with a mix of peas and clover. I think eventually deer do move towards these areas, but it's not perfect. If you are interested in this kind of work, Craig Harper out of Tennessee has done some great work, and he has a great guide for wildlife food plots if you want to attract deer or other types of wildlife away from certain areas. Briefly, there's cool season perennials, cool season annuals, and you have warm season plants as well as the sort of 3 breakdowns. And I think forest openings can provide a lot of attraction as well. Just opening up the canopy, having that sunlight reach the floor, you have this flush of all sorts of species come up from the ground. It has a lot of nutrition and can sort of feed deer and keep them out of other areas. Let's turn to fencing now. Some of the simplest things, if you only have a small number of trees that you're trying to manage, you can do sort of individual tree management. If you have hog wire around, these white posts on the left are step-in stakes. They cost about $2 at Tractor Supply, and you can make your own sort of tree cages this way. Do note that rabbits can get inside of there, so that can be something to think about. The one on the right with the chicken wire, rabbits can't get into. Probably for forestry operations, instead of doing those, while those do work, the more commonly used tool are individual tree shelters. And here's a picture of what those look like on the right. Penn State has a great resource on the sort of pros and cons of these types of tree shelters, but they help to protect them until they get above the deer grazing height. There's some other great low-cost fence designs. I think one of the biggest issue with fencing is the cost, but there are ways in which you can do it at relatively low costs. And you can see an example here where you can utilize existing trees and actually plastic mesh and with a wire that holds it up as a way to keep deer out of a certain area if you want to actually do fencing. If you really have a major problem and you want a much more permanent solution, 8-foot woven wire fences do the trick as well. Although you might occasionally get a deer inside of there. Electric fences, perhaps one of the less expensive options out there. I think it's quite cost effective. It does, I think the biggest cost associated with electric fence is the labor involved in patrolling them and making sure they don't get tangled up. This is on the left, a 3-wire electric fence. You can also use 2 wires that can be pretty effective as well. That picture on the right shows a little dab of peanut butter on aluminum foil on that electric fence. And that's important, especially when you first put it up, to train the deer. If this is electric, they put their nose on it and they get a zap and they quickly become trained that this is not something they want to go near. There are even more effective electric fences. This is a 2-tiered option. This adds a depth component to it. Deer don't have great depth perception, so they can't really see how to jump through this. And this is a more effective option than the other one. It does take up more space, obviously, to put up and is more maintenance and equipment. I'll share resources for all of these as well in the chat at the end. George Timko mentioned that there are some new initiatives to cover the cost of deer fencing. There's a new program, it just started, that the Maryland Department of Agriculture put out, and they will pay $5 per foot cost share of fences, and the applicant pays for the rest. This is a new program, but they did not get any applicants this year. It could only be, the fencing had to be adjacent to grass buffers on water courses only. So there's some limitations to it. but another aspect that might be useful for people to know about. Repellents, I'm going to run through repellents now, and then we'll get to that last one, population management. My colleague, Jonathan Kays, who's recently retired, but helping us out a little bit part-time, did a great fact sheet on different types of repellents and looked at the costs and effectiveness of them. They do work, they can be expensive. I've heard of people making homemade solutions, and again, I think they can be effective. They generally wear off after a couple of weeks, so it requires a respraying effort. Another factor is what your neighbors are doing. If everybody puts on repellent, at some point the deer will just hold their nose and go into a place if they're out of food. So if you don't mind like shifting the problem to your neighbors, this can be effective, but it can be expensive, and it's relatively short-lived. Here's a slide from a presentation out in Arkansas looking at garden plants and how the repellents all worked comparably well. There were some that might have worked a little bit better and a little bit longer. After about a month or two, they started wearing off, but certainly worked better than the control, which is that gray line at the bottom. There are home-based repellents. If you're working on a relatively small scale, I know people even at one of our research stations that handles, it's probably it might be a 50-acre area field, and he walks the perimeter and grates Irish Spring, the green Irish Spring soap on the perimeter of the research plots every week or two. And he says he's had great success. Cayenne pepper, I've also heard, can be quite effective. So these are some home-based solutions. Again, depending on the size, if you're dealing in relatively small acreages, something like this could work for you. Dog repellents also can help. With the advent of these underground fences, they can do a lot of good, but really one of the key things is you have to have your dogs out at night. And that's when the deer are really coming out in a lot of cases. If you have a nice flat area and your topography is preferential, a pair of dogs could cover 20 to 30 acres. But if you have areas that have more topography, you might get less coverage than that. But really the key is making sure your dogs are out roaming the property at night, which can be a little bit different for a lot of folks if you have a family dog in the house. So population management, that last topic, and I'll wrap this up quickly. George talked a lot about this topic. He talked about the role of hunting. Hunting licenses helps to fund our fish and game agencies, our Department of Natural Resources. And while hunting led to the declines in a lot of our wildlife species, it's actually was fundamental in recovering many of especially our game species. And again, maintaining our natural resources departments that manage for all sorts of wildlife. An aspect of lethal control that some people might want to try is this idea of quality deer management. The idea is that you reduce the harvest of young bucks, and this is really oriented towards somebody who wants to grow mature, somewhat trophy animals or mature bucks on their property to see and to have part of the property. And the idea is you reduce the harvest of these 1.5-year-old, what we call spike bucks, and you allow them to grow to 2.5 and 3.5 years old. And at the same time, you increase your harvest of the does, which are the reproducing aspects of the population. What this does is it sort of increases your ratio of bucks. So you have, instead of 1 buck for 10 does, which is 1 or 2 bucks for 10 does, which is commonly what you see, you can get, 40, 50, almost half the population of bucks. And when you really apply this, so you can get a lot higher ratios and see more bucks around, which is just a fun thing to see for everybody, hunters and non-hunters alike. And then the part of the dynamic of this is you can have a smaller overall population and more opportunities for hunting, more mature bucks. So this was really pushed by the Quality Deer Management Association, which is now named the National Deer Association. They have great resources on their website about food plots, different types of harvest techniques, and things like that. I'll mention a couple things in terms of lethal control. If you want to have a hunting program, it can help reduce and repel deer, especially during that hunting season. It's a lot of people use elevated stands to keep your scent off the ground. It also has a safety component in which your trajectory of any projectiles, your firearms, bullets, arrows are all going downward into the ground, by and large. Scent also is a really important aspect if you're going to have successful hunting. So something to think about and manage. I always have to throw this in is make sure you're safe. If you go up in a tree, have a harness if you can. It's I met a couple of people in my life who've had broken backs and or paralyzed from falling out of trees from hunting. It's just not worth it. So I encourage everybody to wear a safety harness when hunting and follow all the recommendations for that. Shooting lanes in your forest can also be a great way to improve your visibility and increase your success rates. And there's a lot of great resources that the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and I've got links to all of these programs that I'll also share. And so wrap up, there's a lot of different approaches. It's a very dynamic issue. Populations change, preferences of the deer change. So it's very hard to guess where they're going to be. And that's what makes it so frustrating, depending on but hopefully this has helped you to understand some of the habits of the animals, times in which they will be grazing more or less, and the kinds of ways you might try to affect their behaviors. So there are a variety of tools available, and they can fit different operations differently depending on your costs and your availability of labor and time. Fencing might work really well. If you want to get into food plots, and the vegetation management might work really well combined with population management. So there's a lot of different options, and hopefully this has helped. I always like to get people's feedback. So if you want to, this is a QR code. You can hold your phone up to the screen on your photo setting and take a picture. You don't even actually take the picture. You just hold the camera app up on this, and it'll take you to a survey, and you can give me feedback on this, or you can go to this link here, go.umd.edu/ENRteach, and that has to be all capitalized or it won't work. Here's my email at the bottom, lukemack@umd.edu, and I will stop there, and I'm looking forward to taking any questions.
Great, thank you very much. So just a quick note, it looks like we have not been successful in unlocking the chat. So an option that we have available to us, I'm happy to add a section to our next or below our next flyer when we send out our emails, and happy to provide links and information there. For folks that don't want to wait for that, I have a very fancy solution of this document real fast. So go.umd.edu/Delmarva for that upcoming education opportunity for forest stewardship. Also, if you don't think or don't know if you receive our flyers regularly, they're very brief, come out once a month. You can email me, mdurbanforest@gmail.com, is kind of the clearinghouse to reach us about the webinar series. So to make sure that you receive those emails, you can contact me there. You can also ask me directly for the links that I'll be getting from Luke, and we will make sure that that information becomes available to everyone. All right, and we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Do feel free to add a few of those. We will start and just kind of go in order. So from Lee, are there any changes planned to address deer wasting disease impact?
George, do you want to handle that one? I think that's maybe a little bit more. You're muted, George, if you're trying to speak. I'm not sure.
Okay.
There you go.
Well, I can attempt to answer that, but that would take quite a while to answer completely. As with all diseases, particularly chronic wasting disease, there's really not much that anyone can do to reduce the spread and incidence of chronic wasting disease. Standard options for managing or reducing CWD include reducing the deer population, reducing contact between deer. So reducing the deer population as in population control, reducing contact between deer as in reducing baiting or feeding in situations where deer interact, salt licks and stuff like that. There's really no way to combat the disease on the landscape, because once it's there, it's in the environment, and then other deer can get it. So That's a big challenge, particularly when it comes to trying to manage CWD. Currently, what we're doing is managing basically charting the spread of the disease across the landscape and trying to limit that spread by educating hunters, preventing hunters from moving deer from the diseased area to other areas where the disease has not been found, and quickly monitoring the area where the disease is to prevent, to check if it is spreading anywhere else. So that the person asking that question can actually contact me directly, or anybody with questions can contact us directly, and we can go into more detail to answer their questions.
Great. And kind of wanted to give you a chance to sort of expand on that. So Peggy, hi Peggy, Cummings asked, can someone discuss the risk of deer transmission of SARS-CoV-2 and chronic wasting disease to hunters?
The current research is that the chance of spread is extremely low. There actually was research done in the state of Pennsylvania that showed that deer can get it, but the chance of it spreading to humans was relatively low. Obviously, people should not be touching, handling, and canoodling with live deer. But in those situations where people live in residential area or urban area where there are deer, it would be best to try to avoid deer, or quite frankly, you probably don't want the deer there because they're probably causing some problems you don't want anyway.
And I could add a little bit to that. I attended a webinar on this topic with CDC and others. There's been no documented transmissions of SARS-CoV-2 from deer to humans. It's probably a very hard thing to measure, but they've never documented that happening, although it does seem as though it spreads in a variety of mammal populations. But as George said, you'd probably have to get pretty close to a deer, and that's pretty hard to do. So it's probably, as George is saying, very low risk. And George, were you talking specifically about COVID or also about CWD, chronic wasting disease?
COVID.
Okay.
Specifically.
Do you want to speak on chronic wasting disease? I think that was part of the question.
Okay, yeah. If you're talking about chronic wasting disease in people, there's never been any transmission. There's been any known transmission of chronic wasting disease from deer to humans, either through people contacting deer that had it and or eating deer that had it. So quite frankly, the evidence is relatively clear that you can't get CWD from deer, but no one will ever say never or always. So in the scientific world, those are two words you generally don't use, but approach it with caution. Basically, if your deer tests positive, or if you're in an area where deer are known to have CWD, basically apply the common sense logic to dressing that deer using gloves, not eating any of the potentially infected parts, such as lymph nodes and brain tissue and spinal cord, et cetera. So, and that information is on our webpage as well, the DNR's deer webpage, when it comes to chronic wasting disease. And a lot of information, and the majority, actually virtually every one of these questions could be answered with specific information on our webpage as well.
Great. We have another pair of questions that I think are pretty closely related. So I'll kind of pose them both and let you two address them. So first, what is the latest info re contraception for deer? And also to please discuss the limitations for non-lethal methods and what approaches might be viable for controlling the deer population in Baltimore City.
Me again?
I think George, I think that would fit you. I can add in after you. I'll let you take your crack.
That was a three-part question. So I'll start, and I can read the bottom one there. What is the latest information regarding contraception for deer? State of the art for contraception for deer obviously addresses the female segment of the population. And there is a drug called Gonacon, which we were the first state to approve, that is the deer has to be captured and hand injected with the drug, and then they have to be marked. Obviously, any deer that's treated with a chemical has to be marked in the event that it might be consumed by a human, a hunter, or motorist, whoever. That contraceptive has not been used in free-ranging deer in wild populations. It was used in closed populations for research purposes, and then no community has stepped up to the plate to utilize that drug. A lot of people want to consider SPAVAC, but SPAVAC has not been approved by the feds. So that's something we won't consider until it does get that final approval. The top tool for using not contraception, but fertility control in general for deer is basically to, if you're going to capture the animals, to surgically sterilize the female and remove her ovaries. Ovaryectomies are probably the most effective method because it takes out the tools that the female needs to reproduce. It also prevents her from recycling and attracting more males into the area, creating a larger population of bucks, which they've seen in some of the studies. So I think I've answered that question pretty clearly. And you said it was a 3-part, so I don't see the other questions, unfortunately, there, Megan. So if you can cue me, I'll be happy to answer those.
Of course, yeah. The follow-up was to please discuss the limitations for non-lethal methods and what approaches are viable for controlling the deer population in Baltimore City.
Okay, the biggest things that limit deer fertility control or deer control in suburban and urban environments is really access to properties. You have hundreds or thousands of residents with miniature parcels of ground that they particularly manage because they're the landowner. And these deer live on all the property surrounding. They're not just one. So those deer live in their home range really covers a lot of different people's turf. And trying to get access to manage deer using either lethal or non-lethal measures in those areas can be virtually impossible because people, really often disagree on how to manage deer or if deer management is needed. So that's probably the biggest restriction on trying to manage deer in the Baltimore urban suburban type environment.
George, you want to describe some of the managed hunts you guys do in certain areas? Like, I feel like they can be pretty effective in certain places.
Of course, managed hunting, of course, is a more restrictive, more organized form of regular old hunting. They're often, the hunters are screened, they have proficiency testing requirements, and they are put and placed in specific areas where they can safely and adequately remove deer without either one encroaching on someone else's property or encroaching on another hunter's turf. And they're usually plotted in a way to try to take advantage of deer movement. So if one hunter spooks a deer, it moves into the range of another one of the managed hunters, and then he or she can take deer in that area. So it really intensely targets deer in some of these environments, such as, and it's been used in suburbs, it's been used in state parks and military facilities, private properties, corporate properties. So it can be highly effective at reducing deer because it's a relatively intense method of hunting versus, Luke going out on a Saturday to kill a deer in his backyard. So it can be very effective.
I see a question on why not sterilize the males from Victoria Sanborns.
That's a great question. And the city of New York has been doing that for quite a while now. They've spent millions of dollars sterilizing thousands of whitetail bucks up, I believe it was Staten Island. And the problem that they found was that because whitetail deer are polygamous, sterilizing the males, it'll work if you get every last male. But if you don't get every last male, there's one or two around, or there's deer in the neighboring areas that realize there's fertile females around, and they come in and impregnate the remaining females. So that study it's very interesting to watch what they've been doing there. But quite frankly, they still have an overabundance of deer. And that's the big problem with using just fertility control, is that you start off with 200, 300 deer per square mile, and you're still going to have way too many deer for a long period of time. And it may take decades, if ever, that you get that population to be reduced through attrition.
I would add, if you can imagine, if you miss one male, a single male buck can impregnate probably easily 10 does. So if you, as George was saying, if you missed a single one, all of a sudden you could still get almost all your, the reason they used buck only hunting for the longest time in the early, when the populations were recovering, is because you could take as many bucks as you wanted, really. If there was just one or two remaining in the area, they could breed most of the does. So that's kind of the challenge with sterilizing the males.
Sure. And to add to that, Luke, even immature males, button bucks without truly visible antlers, they can do the deed. And quite frankly, I remember talking to a researcher, and I can't remember if it was Mississippi State deer pen or where it was, but they had removed what they had thought were all of the male deer from the pen because they didn't want breeding to occur. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, all the females got pregnant. And what they realized was there was one very lucky button buck living amongst them, and he impregnated, I think it was 36 does. So, and that's anecdotal, but the fact is, even targeting antlered bucks, even with that fertility study in Staten Island, they have a hard time keeping pace with it because, quite frankly, juvenile bucks can do the deed.
All right, so we are 2 minutes over, but if you guys don't mind staying on to answer our final question,
Sure.
We have one left to answer in the chat, and it is, how do we get these suburban refuges open to hunters? Are there ways to encourage deer management in small-scale woodlots outside of the historic framework of hunting in Maryland?
If you have the answer to that one, Aaron, you're going to make a lot of money. That's one of our biggest challenges. And we can encourage that. We can encourage the landowners to allow hunting. We can encourage the tools that we've talked about, but it has to happen on not just one parcel of ground, but all the adjoining parcels of ground where that deer herd resides. So that can be the biggest challenge. And again, the answer, if we had the answer, we would be using it.
Yeah, I would add though that I would say Maryland has been more successful than a lot of states. I feel like Maryland's programs are highly developed, and I've participated in some of their suburban management hunts in Howard County. And it does take county resources to run programs like that, but I have been very impressed by sort of organization involved and the opportunities and the support by DNR to allow that to happen. The trick is getting the community on board, the homeowners association, to get the threshold that would allow the community to have something like that in your area. One thing I would note is you can legally, depending on the county, you can legally hunt if you're more than, I think it's for archery in some counties, it's just 100 feet from another residence. I think for firearms is at 300 feet from a residence. So in some of these sparser populated areas, people can hunt on relatively small parcels, and you can get permission from your neighbors as well, and that you can hunt in relatively small areas. So there are these kinds of opportunities in homeowner associations where you might not get everybody's approval, but you could allow people in the community to hunt certain areas on their own property if they follow the guidelines for distances from residences or have permission from those residents. So there's those options as well without having to do a fully organized thing.
All right, well, I think that will wrap it up for today. So Gary, any final comments? While he unmutes, I will just thank
There you
our audience
go.
again and thank our speakers especially. So thank you to Luke and George for a very informative hour.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Megan, for your moderation of this panel. It's been quite informative on an issue that a great many people are concerned about. The interest, I've always been surprised about the level of interest in this topic from a very wide population. So I want to thank both of our panelists today for participating, and I encourage them to continue to make available the information that they've cited so that we can post it adequately on our website and point you to the links on the sites that you've already identified. And again, I want to thank you for your participation today. And with that, I'm going to conclude today's webinar and remind everyone it should be posted a little bit later in August. Luke, did you have a final comment?
Yeah, I just saw Jennifer Alcock wrote a resources list, and I just saw that we can post, I posted all the resources in the, as a response to her question in the chat. So we don't have a chat, but in the question, the answer, I have a whole bunch of lists to links of resources, from the fencing to repellents to food plots, unpalatable plants. So you should be able to see that up on your question and answer screen now. So.
Thank you very
And
much.
if you can't, and if you don't have time to copy paste, which I recommend doing quickly now before everything closes, we will send that out as part of our next email blast. So that will be available to folks. And I believe we should be able to host that on our website as
Sure,
well.
we can do that. No problem at all.
Perfect.
Thank you very much for joining us today and for registering for the webinar. Please join us in the future for the programs. We're always anxious to have that. And if you have input on topics that we ought to be covering in the future, please provide that at MarylandForestryFoundation.org on the website. Thank you very much, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.